Agriculture is the world's most important industry. It provides us with almost all our food. It also supplies materials for two other basic human needs, clothing and shelter. In addition, agriculture provides materials used in making many industrial products, such as paints and medicines. About half the world's workers are employed in agriculture, far more than in any other industry. Agriculture is one of the world's oldest industries. It began to develop about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. At that time, certain Middle Eastern tribes discovered how to grow plants from seeds and how to raise animals in captivity. Soon after the tribes mastered these skills, they began to depend chiefly on farming for food. Before the development of agriculture, people got all their food by gathering wild plants, hunting, and fishing. They had to search for food continually, which left them little time for other activities. But as agriculture developed and farm output increased, fewer people were needed to produce food. The non-farmers could then develop the arts, crafts, trades, and other activities of civilized life. Agriculture therefore greatly affected the food supply and made civilization possible. Farmers provided more food than hunters and gatherers could supply. But for many centuries, improvements in agriculture came slowly. Farming depended heavily on human and animal labor, and farmers had few tools to make their land and labor more productive. Then in the late 1600s, inventors began to develop machines for planting, cultivating, and harvesting crops. Over the years, farm machinery has been steadily improved. Since the early 1900s, scientists have developed better breeds of livestock, better varieties of plants, and highly effective fertilizers and pesticides. All these improvements have greatly reduced the need for farm labor and have enormously increased farm output. Food is by far the most important farm product, but farms also provide many other products, from natural fibers to ornamental flowers and trees. Some crops are used only to feed livestock. These forage crops include alfalfa, clover, and many grasses, such as brome grass and timothy. Forage crops are important because they make commercial livestock production possible. Food products. Farms provide almost all the world's food, including some fish and game. Most food products come from crops. The rest come from animals, especially cattle, hogs, poultry, sheep, and other livestock. The world's farmers grow about 85 major food crops. They can be divided into 8 groups. The main group is cereal grains. Grain is grown on half the world's cropland and supplies much of the nourishment in the human diet. The chief grains are barley, corn, millet, oats, rice, rye, sorghum, and wheat. Various root crops make up the second most important group of food crops. Like cereal grains, root crops are grown throughout the world and are a basic food for many people. The leading root crops are potatoes, sweet potatoes, and a tropical plant called cassava. The 6 remaining groups of major food crops are pulses, which consist mainly of dry beans and dry peas, fruits and vegetables other than root crops and pulses, oil-bearing crops, such as soybeans and coconuts, sugar-bearing crops, especially sugar cane and sugar beets, nuts and cocoa beans, coffee, and tea. Some oil crops, especially soybeans, are used to make flour and meal as well as oil. Cattle, chickens, goats, hogs, sheep, turkeys, and other livestock are the main animals raised for food. Livestock are raised in every country and supply nearly all the world's meat, eggs, and milk. Farmers also raise other animals for food. For example, many farmers keep bees for honey. Farmers on fish farms raise freshwater food fish, such as catfish and trout, and saltwater shellfish, such as mussels and oysters. Natural fibers come from a variety of plants and animals raised on farms. Mills and factories use the fibers to make fabrics, yarn, and other textile products. Cotton, flax, hemp, jute, and sisal are the chief plant fibers. Wool, the principal animal fiber, comes mainly from sheep but also from such animals as goats and members of the camel family. Silk fibers are obtained from the cocoons of silkworms. Farms in Japan and China raise most of the world's silkworms. The development of nylon and other synthetic fibers since the early 1900s has reduced the demand for natural fibers in some countries. Other agricultural products. Many farms provide other raw materials for industry besides fibers. These materials include natural rubber, animal hides, which are used to make leather, and such vegetable oils as castor oil and linseed oil. These oils are used in a variety of products, from paints to medicines. Some farmers grow trees for timber, though most timber comes from natural forests. Many farmers raise tobacco. Others grow ornamental flowers, trees, and shrubs. A few farmers raise such animals as foxes and mink for their fur. Kinds of agriculture. The many kinds of agriculture can be classified as commercial and subsistence. Commercial farms produce crops and animals chiefly for sale. Subsistence farmers produce goods mainly for themselves. Commercial agriculture. The great majority of farms in industrialized countries are commercial farms. They can be divided into two main groups, specialized farms and diversified farms. Specialized farms earn all or most of their income from the sale of one kind of crop or livestock. Many of these farms use mass production methods and require a large investment in equipment and supplies. Crops produced for sale are called cash crops. Many commercial farms raise only one cash crop. These farms are known as one-crop or single-crop farms. Much of the world's wheat is grown on huge one-crop farms on the North American Great Plains and in Ukraine. Large single-crop farms in tropical and subtropical areas are often called plantations. Plantations raise such crops as bananas, coffee, rice, sugar cane, and tea. Other specialized farms raise two or more cash crops, though most of their income comes from one crop. Major crops raised on such farms include cotton, tobacco, oilseeds, and various grains. The main kinds of specialized livestock farms include cattle and sheep ranches, and dairy, poultry, and egg, and hog farms. Most cattle and sheep ranches consist mainly of grazing land. In some major beef-producing countries, such as Argentina and Australia, cattle are kept on ranches until they are to be slaughtered. In the United States, Canada, and a few other countries, most ranchers ship their cattle to feedlots after the animals are 5 to 12 months old. Feedlots can feed cattle for market much faster than the animals can be fattened on the range. The typical feedlot practices highly intensive agriculture and can feed thousands of cattle on a very small area of land. The animals are kept in pens and given large amounts of grain and other high-energy feed. Dairy farms specialize in raising milk cows. The typical dairy farm is much larger than a poultry farm but far smaller than a ranch. Most dairy farmers raise their own feed crops, but many others buy their feed. Most poultry and egg farms are also highly intensive. Such a farm may cover only about 0.4 hectare, yet it may raise 20,000 or more laying hens or broiler chickens at a time. The birds are kept in temperature-controlled buildings and given high-energy feed. Diversified farms raise a variety of crops and livestock. Such farms produce crops to sell and to feed their livestock. Most farms in Europe and many in the Midwestern United States are diversified farms. Diversified farming is less risky than specialized farming. Bad weather, insects, or disease may ruin a year's output on a specialized farm. Or the market price for a particular product may decline sharply. But on a diversified farm, losses from one product may often be covered by profits from other products. Subsistence agriculture. Millions of farm families in Africa, Asia, and Latin America produce barely enough food to subsist on, that is, to meet their own needs. Subsistence farming depends heavily on human labor and requires only the most basic farm tools. Although subsistence farmers produce goods chiefly for themselves, they may also raise small amounts for sale. This type of farming is often called semi-subsistence agriculture. Most subsistence farmers have one or more small plots of land, which they farm year after year. Such farms are common in the rice-growing regions of southern Asia and in parts of Africa and Latin America. In some countries, many subsistence farmers do not have permanent farms. Instead, they live in groups that move from place to place within a large area fixed by custom. At each stop, the members of the community establish temporary farms. The number of such communities has declined since the mid-1900s. But large communities still exist in certain parts of the world. They practice two main kinds of farming: shifting cultivation and nomadic herding. Shifting cultivation is an ancient farming method. It is widely used on the grasslands and in the forests of Central Africa, northeastern South America, and parts of Southeast Asia. The soil in most of these regions is not particularly fertile. But to keep it as fertile as possible, a farm community grows crops on the same land for only a year or two. The community then cultivates an adjoining area or moves to a different part of its territory. At each new location, the grass and trees are cut down and burned. Ashes from the burned grass and trees fertilize the soil. The abandoned land returns to grass or forest and can be farmed again. Nomadic herding has long been practiced in desert regions of Africa and Asia. These regions are far too dry to grow crops. But they have enough wild grasses to support small herds of camels, sheep, goats, and other livestock. Tribes of desert nomads keep such herds to provide the necessities of life. The nomads depend on their animals for milk, cheese, and meat, and they live in tents and wear clothing made from the skins and hair of the animals. A tribe settles in an area until their livestock have stripped it of grass. The tribe and its herd then move on to a fresh grazing area. Agriculture around the world. About 4.8 billion hectares of land, more than a third of the Earth's total land area, are used for farming. Farmers grow crops on about a third of this land. Farmers use the rest of this land for raising livestock. To grow crops, farmers need fairly level land and tillable soil. In addition, the climate must provide a certain amount of warmth and moisture. For example, most crops need a frost-free period, or growing season, of at least 90 days to develop from seeds into mature plants. Many crops require much longer. Except for the far north and Antarctica, most regions of the world have a growing season long enough for at least some crops. However, many of these regions receive less than 10 inches of rain a year. Few crops can grow in such dry climates without irrigation. Climate also largely determines the kinds of crops a farmer can grow. Such crops as bananas and cocoa beans grow well only in a tropical climate. Other crops, such as potatoes and apples, need a cooler climate. Many plants, including both bananas and potatoes, require much moisture. However, some plants, such as sorghum and wheat, grow best in a climate that is fairly dry. The United States. Farmland covers about half the area of the United States, that is, nearly 405 million hectares. The United States has about 188 million hectares of cropland, more than any other country in the world. The remaining U.S. farmland is used for raising livestock. Only about 2% of all American workers are employed on farms. Yet the United States produces much of the world's farm output, including 25% of the beef and 15% of the grain, milk, and eggs. American farmers can produce such great quantities of food for two main reasons. These reasons are, first, the United States has vast areas of fertile soil, and the climate in many of these areas is ideal for agriculture, and second, American farmers use scientific farming methods and much farm machinery. Certain regions of the United States are known for particular farm products. The Midwestern states, for example, are famous as the center of U.S. corn and hog production. More than two-thirds of the nation's wheat is grown in the Great Plains region and the Pacific Northwest. But because of the many scientific improvements in agriculture, many farm goods that were formerly associated with a particular region of the United States are now produced over a much wider area. The center of cotton production, for example, has shifted from the southern states to irrigated farmland. In the Southwest, the broad grasslands of the West were once the nation's chief cattle grazing areas. But the development of special breeds of cattle and new species of grass has helped create major grazing areas in the southern states. Dairy farming was once concentrated in a region that extended from New York to Minnesota. But large, productive dairy farms are now found in every state of the nation. The United States has about 2,100,000 farms. They average about 191 hectares in size. Most farmland in the United States is privately owned. The federal government owns much grazing land in the Rocky Mountain and Great Plains regions. The government leases most of this land to ranchers. Since the 1920s, the number of farms in the United States has decreased steadily, while the average size has increased. The number of full-time farmers has also declined. Today, most operators of small farms also have non-farm jobs. About two-thirds of all American farmers receive more than half of their total income from such sources. Organized support for U.S. agriculture is provided by farm organizations, government agencies, and extension services. A large number of farmers belong to marketing cooperatives, which work to find profitable markets for their members' products. Since the early 1960s, commodity organizations have also become important among farmers. Each organization represents the economic interests of farmers who specialize in a particular product, such as cattle, hogs, corn, soybeans, or wheat. Commodity organizations try to improve market conditions through product promotion, by funding research, and by promoting favorable legislation. Government plays an important role in United States agriculture. Federal and state laws deal with such matters as minimum farm prices, preservation of the environment, quality standards for farm products, and the inspection of food. Government agencies enforce these laws and administer government farm programs. Many agricultural careers are directly related to farming and ranching. But the number of U.S. farms and farmers has declined over the past few decades. Farm workers include self-employed farmers and hired managers, supervisors, and laborers. Many people who plan to become farmers or farm managers attend an agricultural college. Some young people prepare for agricultural occupations by taking special courses in high school and participating in such extracurricular activities as 4-H and FFA, Future Farmers of America, groups. A majority of supervisors receive their training on the job. Many U.S. farm laborers are migrants, that is, they move into a region at harvest time to help pick and process the crops. After the harvest is completed, the migrants move to another location. Canada. Canada's farmland covers about 7% of the country's total land area. Most of the country's farmland lies in the provinces that border the United States. About half of Canada's farmland is used to grow crops. The nation has about 250,000 farms. They average about 665 acres in size. Canada has two major farming regions. The larger one extends through the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The other region lies in southeastern Canada. The prairie provinces grow most of Canada's wheat, rapeseed, and barley. These provinces also produce about two-thirds of Canada's most valuable farm product, beef cattle. Farms in the southeast produce corn, dairy products, eggs, fruits, and vegetables. Agriculture is organized and supported in Canada much as it is in the United States. Almost all the farms are privately owned. Most owners live and work on their farm. And many of them also hold a part-time job off the farm. Contract farming has become increasingly important. Many farmers belong to the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and the National Farmers Union, Agriculture Canada, an agency of the federal government, is the country's chief agricultural agency. Each province also has its own Department of Agriculture. Latin America. About 36% of the land in Latin America has been developed for farming. Much of the region lies in the tropics, and the tropical soils and climate are not well suited to many of the crops grown in cooler regions. The largest and most fertile farming areas are in Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and southern Brazil. Most farmers in Latin America are subsistence farmers who live mainly on such crops as cassava, corn, dry beans, or potatoes. Commercial agriculture is also important in Latin America, however. Wealthy families own most of the region's commercial farms, and hired workers or tenant farmers supply the labor. Plantations in tropical Latin America grow most of the world's commercial supplies of bananas and coffee, about a third of the cocoa beans, and more than a fourth of the sugar cane. Large farms and ranches in Argentina and Brazil produce great quantities of food and other agricultural products. Both countries are among the world's top producers of beef cattle and soybeans. Brazil is also the world's leading producer of oranges, and Argentina is one of the chief wool-producing countries. Europe. About 50% of the land in Europe, excluding Russia, is farmland. Most of this land is level and receives abundant rainfall. As a result, approximately 60% of Europe's farmland is used to grow crops. Farmers in most European countries use modern farming methods and equipment. Russia has the largest land area of any country in the world. It ranks among the leading countries in area of farmland. But farmland makes up only about 15% of Russia's land. The majority of this farmland is in Europe. Most of the Asian part of Russia is too dry or has too short a growing season for farming. Some of the land in this region is suitable for raising livestock, however. Western Europe has only about 4% of the world's farmland. Yet it is one of the most productive farming regions on the earth. Western European farms produce about 15% of the world's potatoes and wheat, about 20% of the eggs, about 30% of the milk and sugar beets, and about 35% of the barley. About 5% of all workers are employed in farming. Agriculture in Western Europe is highly intensive. For example, most of the region's wheat is grown on small farms, and the farmers use large amounts of fertilizer on each unit of land. This intensive operation, combined with abundant rainfall, results in wheat yields that often average about 40% higher than those in the United States. Western European farms are usually smaller and much more diversified than those in the United States and Canada. The typical farm covers only 14 to 16 hectares. It is used to raise alfalfa, barley, potatoes, sugar beets, and wheat, as well as various kinds of livestock, such as cattle and hogs. Specialized farms produce great quantities of citrus fruits, grapes, milk, olives, poultry, and vegetables. Most Western European farms are privately owned. About 16% of the workers in Eastern Europe work on farms. Farmers in Eastern Europe raise many of the same kinds of crops and livestock that Western European farmers raise. Most farms in Eastern Europe are owned by individual farmers or by companies. Some of these farms are much larger than those in Western Europe. Some are run as joint stock companies. Managers and farmers on these farms are part owners who own stock in their farms. They buy their own equipment and decide what to grow and how to market their products. Farmers on joint stock farms receive a share in profits and sometimes a small wage. During the period of communist rule, national governments owned most of the farmland in Eastern Europe. The main kinds of government-owned farms were state farms and collective farms. State farms were managed entirely by the government. The government paid wages and collected profits for the farm products. Collective farms were controlled by the government but managed partly by workers. Workers were paid wages and shared in profits. Asia. approximately 45% of the land in Asia is used for agriculture. Asia's farmland is extremely varied. It ranges from the high, dry plateaus of eastern Turkey to the hot, wet lowlands of Indonesia and Malaysia. The continent has more than 100 million farms. Most of these farms cover less than 0.4 hectare and are subsistence farms. Asia also has many large commercial farms that are operated with scientific methods. The state owns most of the farms in the communist countries of Asia. In Israel, most of the farms are cooperatively or collectively owned by the farmworkers. In other countries, the majority of farms are privately owned. In the past, much of the privately owned farmland in many Asian countries was worked by poor tenant farmers. The rents generally were so high that most tenant families barely survived. About 60% of Asia's workers are farmers. Subsistence farmers grow such crops as cassava, rice, sweet potatoes, wheat, or yams. Many subsistence farmers also raise some livestock, usually a few chickens, goats, hogs, or sheep. Commercial farming is important in Asia's few industrial countries, such as Israel and Japan, and in China and Malaysia. China is the world's leading producer of cotton and rice, and it ranks second only to the United States in the production of corn. Malaysia leads all other nations in the production of palm oil. Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia are all major producers of natural rubber. India produces more tea than any other country. The Philippines ranks as the leading producer of coconuts and coconut products. Plantations and many small farms throughout tropical Asia raise such export crops as bananas, coconut, sugar cane, and tea. Australia and New Zealand. Farmland covers about 60% of Australia and more than 50% of New Zealand. In both countries, more than 90% of the farmland is pasture or relatively dry grazing land and is used mainly for raising cattle and sheep. Australia leads the world in wool production and is an important producer of beef, lamb, mutton, and dairy products. New Zealand also ranks high in wool, lamb, and mutton production. Most of the cropland in Australia and New Zealand lies along the east coasts of both countries and in the southeastern and southwestern parts of Australia. Farms in these regions are operated in much the same way as farms in the major crop-growing areas of North America. Grains are the most important crops in both Australia and New Zealand. Australia produces large quantities of wheat. About 5% of the workers in Australia and about 10% of the workers in New Zealand are employed in agriculture. Australian farms average nearly 2,000 hectares in size. New Zealand farms average about 305 hectares. But the average farm size in both countries is much smaller if large livestock ranches are not included. Thus, the typical Australian farm, for example, covers about 135 hectares. Most farms in both countries are privately owned commercial operations. Africa. Deserts and tropical rain forests cover much of Africa. Only about a third of the land is used for farming. But about 60% of all workers are farmers. As in Latin America and Asia, subsistence agriculture is common in Africa. The main subsistence crops include bananas, barley, cassava, corn, sorghum, sweet potatoes, and yams. Commercial agriculture centers in a few widely scattered areas. Irrigated farms along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and in the Nile River Valley produce cotton, dates, grapes, olives, and wheat. Plantations and small farms in the tropics produce cocoa beans, coffee, cotton, palm kernels and oil, peanuts, sisal, tea, and tobacco. Africa's richest farming country is South Africa. Unlike most other African countries, South Africa has large areas of fertile soil and a middle-latitude climate that is well suited to large-scale farming. Commercial farmers there are major producers of beef cattle, citrus fruits, corn, sheep, and sugar cane. History of agriculture. For hundreds of thousands of years, prehistoric people lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. Then about 8000 BC, people took the first steps toward agriculture. Some tribes discovered that plants can be grown from seeds. They also learned that certain animals could be tamed and then raised in captivity. These two discoveries marked the beginning of the domestication of plants and animals. Scholars believe that domestication began in the Middle East and then spread to surrounding areas. Later, people in other parts of the world independently learned how to domesticate plants and animals. Agriculture developed independently in northern and southeastern Asia between 1500 and 1400 BC, and in central Mexico by 1500 BC. It spread to other parts of the world from these areas and from the Middle East. The first great civilizations arose in two regions of the Middle East. One region was the Nile River Valley of Egypt, the other was Mesopotamia, which lay northeast of Egypt between and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Both regions had fertile soil, but neither received enough rain for crops to grow. Farmers discovered, however, that they could raise crops during most of the year if they used river water for irrigation. By about 3000 BC, Egypt and Mesopotamia had developed the world's first large-scale irrigation systems. Also by about 3000, Egyptian and Mesopotamian farmers invented a plow that oxen could pull. Earlier farmers had pulled their plows by hand. The ox-drawn plows worked much better and faster and required much less human labor. The Roman Empire began as a country of small farms on the Italian peninsula before 500 BC. By the AD 200s, Rome had conquered much of Europe and the Middle East and the entire Mediterranean coast of Africa. As Rome grew, farms within the empire increased in size and became highly specialized. Most large farms specialized in raising wheat, which formed the basis of the Roman diet. The Romans introduced into Europe the advanced farming techniques of the Middle East, such as the ox-drawn plow and methods of irrigation. The Romans also developed new farming methods. For example, they began the practice of leaving half of every field fallow each year. The fallow soil could store nutrients and moisture for a crop the following year. The Romans also developed systems of crop rotation. European farmers continued to improve plants and livestock by selective breeding during the Middle Ages. Many special-purpose livestock breeds were developed. For example, a breed of dairy cow that gave especially rich milk was developed in northwestern Europe about 1100. This breed, called the Guernsey, is still a major source of milk used to make butter. The European voyages of discovery that began in the 1400s greatly affected agriculture throughout the world. Crops and livestock that had been developed in isolated regions became widely known. Potatoes, for example, were unknown in Europe until Spanish explorers brought them from Peru in the 1500s. American Indians had developed advanced systems of agriculture by the time the first European explorers arrived. In various parts of the Americas, Indian farmers grew cocoa beans, corn, peanuts, peppers, rubber trees, squash, sweet potatoes, tobacco, and tomatoes. Europeans first learned of these crops, and how best to grow them, from the Indians. By the late 1600s, England, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain had colonies throughout the Americas. In tropical regions, the colonists established plantations that specialized in growing such crops as cocoa beans, coffee, and sugar for export. Labor was supplied by black slaves imported from Africa or by the native-born Indians, who were forced to work at low wages. Agriculture developed more slowly in the French colonies in what is now eastern Canada. The French, who controlled most of eastern Canada from the late 1500s until 1763, did little to encourage farming. Much of the land was owned by nobles or merchants called seigneurs. During the early 1700s, a great change in farming called the Agricultural Revolution began in Britain. The revolution resulted from a series of discoveries and inventions that made farming much more productive than ever before. The Agricultural Revolution was brought about mainly by three developments. They were improved crop growing methods, advances in livestock breeding, and the invention of new farm equipment. improved crop growing methods. In the early 1700s, a retired English politician named Charles Townshend began to experiment with crop rotation. He found that turnips could be used as one of the 4 crops in a 4-field rotation system. The other crops consisted of 2 grains, especially varieties of wheat, and a legume, such as alfalfa or clover. Each crop either added nutrients to the soil or absorbed different kinds and amounts of nutrients. Farmers therefore did not have to leave any land fallow, as in 2- and 3-field rotation systems. Advances in livestock breeding. In the late 1700s, an English farmer named Robert Bakewell showed how livestock could be improved by intensively breeding animals with desirable traits. Bakewell produced improved breeds of cattle, horses, and sheep. He became best known for developing a breed of sheep that could be raised for meat as well as for wool. Earlier breeds of sheep were expensive to raise for meat because they fattened too slowly. As a result, most sheep were raised for wool only. But Bakewell's breed, called the Leicester, fattened quickly. It could therefore be raised for slaughter at a reasonable cost. The cost was so low, in fact, that mutton soon became the most popular meat in England. The invention of new farm equipment. The first important inventor of the agricultural revolution was Jethro Tull, an English gentleman farmer. Tull lived during the late 1600s and early 1700s. But his inventions were not widely used until the late 1700s. During the late 1700s and early 1800s, inventors began to work on machines to harvest and process the ever-increasing amount of grain being produced by U.S. farmers. In 1834, Cyrus McCormick, an American inventor, patented the first successful harvesting machine, or reaper. Also in 1834, 2 American brothers, Hiram and John Pitts, patented a combined portable threshing machine and fanning mill. Their machine became the model for most modern threshers. During the early 1800s, inventors began work on developing a combined harvester and thresher, called a combine. But combines were not widely used until the early 1900s. The first successful gasoline-powered tractors were made in the United States in the early 1890s. However, they were not powerful enough for most farm work. By the early 1900s, engineers had designed models powerful enough to pull a plow. The first all-purpose tractors appeared in the 1920s. They could be used to power a variety of farm machinery, from combines to cotton pickers. The new tractors gradually replaced work animals and steam-powered machines on almost all U.S. farms. Today, there are millions of farm tractors in use throughout the world. During the 1960s, scientists introduced varieties of wheat and rice that gave much higher yields than earlier varieties. The new varieties were intended mainly to help various poor nations, such as India and Mexico, increase their food supply. This effort proved so successful that it has been called the Green Revolution. Since the beginning of modern chemistry in the late 1700s, scientists have produced many kinds of synthetic chemicals for use in agriculture. These chemicals include fertilizers, insecticides, herbicides, or weed killers, and chemicals to control plant and animal diseases. All these chemicals have helped increase farm production dramatically. Recent developments. The demand for food throughout the world is constantly increasing. To help meet this demand, farmers have expanded their food output enormously. The largest increase in food demand has occurred in the non-industrial, or developing, countries. Rapid population growth in these countries has been chiefly responsible for the increase. But most developing countries produce barely enough food to meet their present needs. And few can afford to import the additional supplies they need to feed their rapidly growing population. The developing countries therefore must expand their food production greatly or face a severe food shortage. Most developing countries, however, lack the resources that scientific farming requires. Many industrial countries sponsor programs that provide farmers in developing countries with low-interest loans and technical training to help modernize their farm operations.